The glass hit the floor before I even saw it thrown. That sound, that sharp little crack of glass on metal decking, is the first thing I remember from that night. Not the shouting, not the alien standing over our table with his 4 eyes narrowed to slits. Just that glass, spinning once, and settling still. My name is Daniel Hart. I was a systems engineer on a trade station called Corin's Reach, sitting on the edge of neutral space where a dozen species came to trade, argue, and occasionally remember why humans were the newest members of the galactic community. We had been part of the wider alliance for 6 years by then. 6 years of being polite, 6 years of being underestimated, 6 years of alien diplomats smiling at us the way you smile at a child who has just learned to tie their shoes. I was not thinking about any of that when I walked into the Hollow Star that night. I was thinking about the drink in my hand and the fact that my shift was finally over. The Hollow Star was the kind of bar you found on every trade station in the sector. Dim lighting, sticky floors, and a bartender who had seen everything twice. It served 11 different species, which meant 11 different kinds of alcohol, most of which would have killed a human on contact. I stuck to the human-safe stuff. Ethan Cole, my closest friend on the station, sat across from me, nursing something blue and smoking gently. "You look tired," Ethan said. "I am tired. You always look tired." "Because I am always tired." He laughed, and for a moment, the bar felt like any bar back on Earth. That was the strange thing about being out here, so far from home. Some nights, you forgot you were surrounded by creatures who had never seen a sunrise the way we had. Laura Bennett joined us a few minutes later. She was our station's junior diplomat, sharp-eyed and quick with words, the kind of person who could talk a hostile trade delegation into a peace agreement before they realized they had been talked into anything. She dropped into the booth beside Ethan with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent all day being patient with people who did not deserve it. "Rough one?" I asked. "The Velkari delegation wanted to renegotiate the water rights again," she said. "For the 4th time this month. Did they get anywhere?" "No, but I got a headache. So somebody won." Beside her, settling into the booth with the careful, curious movements of someone still learning how human furniture worked, sat Vex. Vex was Tholix, a young cadet from a species known for their long lifespans and their obsession with cataloging other cultures. Vex had been assigned to study humans for the past year, and in that time had become something like family to the 3 of us. Tholix had pale blue skin, 4 slender arms, and eyes that changed color depending on mood. Right now they were a soft, curious gold. "I have a question," Vex said. "You always have a question," Ethan said. "This one is important. Why do humans say I could eat a horse when you clearly cannot and would not want to?" Laura nearly choked on her drink laughing. I grinned into my glass. This was the good part of the night, the part where the galaxy felt small and friendly and full of easy jokes. I want you to remember this feeling, because it did not last. The Hollow Star had a section near the back reserved, unofficially, for a group of Corveth traders who came through the station every few weeks. The Corveth were a proud species, built like walking armor, with thick gray hides and shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway. They stood taller than any of us, stronger than any of us, and they knew it. Among their own kind, status was everything. You did not simply exist in Corveth society. You earned your place by proving, again and again, that you were stronger than the person standing next to you. They had a particular fondness for testing humans. It had become something of a ritual at the Hollow Star. A Corveth trader would wander over to a table of humans, make some comment about our size, our lifespan, our lack of natural weapons, and wait to see how we reacted. Most nights, we laughed it off. Humans have a long history of being underestimated, and most of us had learned not to take the bait. It was easier to smile and buy another round than to make a scene in a bar that served 11 species who all outweighed you. That night, the Corveth at the back table had been drinking for hours before we arrived. Their leader was a trader named Draz, someone I had crossed paths with before during cargo negotiations. He was not unpleasant exactly. He was simply a creature who had never once, in his long life, been told no by someone smaller than him. Draz noticed Vex first. That should have been the moment I understood something was wrong. Draz did not usually pay attention to the Tholics. Most Corvith considered them too soft, too cautious, not worth the effort of mockery. But that night, for whatever reason, Draz stood up from his table, drink in hand, and walked over to us with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to hurry. "The little scholar sits with the pets," Draz said, looking down at Vex. The bar did not go quiet. It was too loud, too full of a dozen different languages, for one comment to silence it. But our table went quiet. I felt Laura go still beside me. Ethan's jaw tightened. Vex's eyes shifted from gold to a pale, uncertain gray. "I am not aware of an insult in that statement," Vex said carefully, the way they always spoke when trying to diffuse something before it grew teeth, though I sense one was intended. Draz laughed, a low rumbling sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest. "Clever pet. They train you well." "We are not training anyone," Laura said, keeping her voice level in the tone she used with difficult delegations. "Vex is a colleague and a friend." Draz's attention shifted to her, and something in his posture changed. He looked at Laura the way you look at something small that has just made a noise you did not expect. "A friend," he repeated. How fragile that word must be, coming from something that lives 60 years if it is fortunate. "I want to be honest with you. I had heard worse." We all had. 6 years of Alliance membership had given every human out here a thick skin when it came to comments about our short lives, our soft bodies, our lack of claws or scales, or any of the natural advantages that so many other species carried into every room. You learned to let it slide off you like water. But there was something in the way Draz looked at Vex, and then at Laura, that told me this was not going to end with words. I had seen that look before. In negotiations that went bad, in trade disputes that turned ugly. It was the look of someone deciding whether you were worth the effort of a lesson. "We're just having a drink," Ethan said, keeping his tone easy, friendly, the universal human signal for, "Let's not do this. No trouble here." Draz smiled, showing teeth that had not evolved for smiling. "No trouble," he agreed. "Yet." He turned and walked back toward his table, and for a moment I let myself believe it was over. That was my mistake. I had spent 6 years learning how other species worked, how their customs and hierarchies shaped the way they treated us, and I still had not learned the most important lesson of all. Some situations do not end with someone walking away. They only end when someone decides they are finished. Vex's eyes had not returned to gold. They stayed a pale, watchful gray, flicking toward the back table every few seconds. Laura reached over and rested a hand on Vex's nearest arm, the kind of small gesture that means more than words. Ethan caught the bartender's eye and asked, quietly, whether the Corvith crew had run a tab, whether they were planning to stay much longer. The bartender, a heavy-set Grellan with skin like tree bark, shook his head slowly. "They stay as long as they want to stay, same as everyone." That was fair enough. This was neutral ground. Nobody owned the Hollow Star. Nobody could ask a paying customer to leave simply because they made someone uncomfortable, not without cause. And Draz had not, technically, done anything that crossed a line. Words were just words, even the ugly ones. I finished my drink slower than I meant to, watching the back table out of the corner of my eye. Draz had returned to his crew, and for a while it looked like the evening might settle back into something ordinary. His companions laughed at something he said, raised their glasses, and the noise of the bar rolled back over our table like water closing over a stone. "We should head out," Laura said eventually. "Early meeting tomorrow." "Agreed," Ethan said, already reaching for his jacket. Vex stood with the careful grace that Tholics always carried, even after several drinks, and for a moment I thought the night might end quietly after all. We had survived 100 nights like this one. Tense moments that dissolved into nothing because everyone involved decided, in the end, that it was not worth the trouble. I should have known better. I should have paid closer attention to the particular way Draz was watching us gather our things, the stillness in his crew that had not been there a few minutes earlier. I did not understand, not yet, what kind of night this was about to become. We were halfway to the door when Draz stood up again. This time he was not smiling. "Leaving so soon, pet trainers," he called out, loud enough that half the bar turned to look. "The little scholar has not finished its drink." Vex stopped walking. I felt more than saw the shift in the room, the way conversations at nearby tables trailed off, the way a Velkari couple near the bar quietly picked up their drinks and moved 2 tables further away. This was the part of the evening where everyone in the room could feel that something was about to happen, the way you feel a storm in the air before the first drop of rain falls. "We were just leaving," Laura said, her voice steady, even though I could see the tension in her shoulders. "No need for any of this." Draz took a step toward us, then another. His crew rose from their table behind him, 4 Corveth traders unfolding themselves to their full, considerable height. I glanced at Ethan. Ethan glanced at me. Neither of us said anything, because there was nothing useful to say. We both understood, in that wordless way old friends understand each other, that whatever happened in the next few minutes, we were not walking out that door and leaving Vex and Laura behind. "You know," Draz said, closing the distance between us with slow, deliberate steps, "I have always wondered something about your species. You are smaller than us, weaker than us. You do not have claws, or hides, or the strength to break a table with your bare hands." He tilted his head, studying me the way you might study an unfamiliar insect. "So tell me, why do you all still walk around like you believe you belong here?" I thought about 6 years of alliance meetings, where humans were seated at the smaller tables. I thought about every trade negotiation, where our species was mentioned last, if we were mentioned at all. I thought about Vex, whose eyes had gone from gold to gray, and stayed there, and Laura, who had spent all day being patient with people who did not deserve it, and Ethan, standing beside me with his jaw set and his hands loose at his sides in a way that told me he was ready for whatever came next. "Because we do belong here," I said, "the same as anyone." Draz's 4 eyes narrowed. Behind him, his crew shifted their weight, the unmistakable posture of creatures preparing for something. "We shall see about that," he said. And then, without any further warning, he reached out one enormous gray hand and shoved me hard in the chest. I stumbled back into a table, and somewhere behind me, I heard glass hit the floor a second time that night. This time, it was the sound that started everything. I did not fall. That surprised him, I think. I caught the edge of the table with one hand, steadied myself, and turned back to face him before the shock of the shove had even fully registered in my body. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a very calm voice was telling me that a creature twice my size had just put his hand on me in a room full of witnesses, and that this was, by any reasonable standard, a very bad situation to be standing in the middle of. The rest of me was not listening to that calm voice. "Daniel," Ethan's voice, low and tight beside me. "Don't." I was not planning to do anything. That is the truth. Whatever anyone tells you afterward, I was not looking for a fight. I had spent 6 years learning to walk away from exactly this kind of moment, because walking away was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, the thing that kept the peace between our small, fragile species and the much larger, much stronger ones we now shared the galaxy with. But Draz was not finished. He reached past me, past Ethan, and closed one massive hand around Vex's nearest arm. "Perhaps," Draz said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent bar, "the scholar should learn what it means to be handled by something stronger, since it spends so much time studying us instead of learning its place." Vex made a sound I had never heard from them before. Not quite pain, not quite fear, something in between, a small startled noise that cut through the noise of the bar like a blade. Their eyes flashed from gray to a stark, alarmed white, and their free arms came up instinctively, uselessly, against a grip that outweighed all four of their limbs combined. I do not remember deciding to move. I remember being still, and then I remember being between Draz and Vex, my hand locked around his wrist, pulling with everything I had. "Let go of her," I said. It came out steadier than I felt. Draz looked down at my hand on his wrist, the way you might look at a bird that had landed on your arm, mildly curious, entirely unthreatened. "Or what, small one?" I did not have a clever answer for that. I did not have any answer at all, really, beyond the simple animal fact that I was not going to stand there and watch him hurt someone I cared about. So instead of answering, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I let go of his wrist, planted my feet, and drove my elbow into the side of his jaw with everything my whole body could put behind it. It did not do much. Corvith hides are thick, built for a much harsher world than the one that raised humans, and my elbow bounced off his jaw, the way a fist bounces off a stone wall. But it was enough to surprise him, enough that his grip on Vex's arm loosened for half a second, long enough for Laura to pull Vex backward, out of reach, behind Ethan. Draz turned his full attention on me. "You," he said, and there was something almost delighted in his voice now, the tone of a creature who had finally found the thing he had been looking for all night. "Will regret that." His crew moved then, all four of them rising from their table and fanning out around us with the easy confidence of predators who had never once lost a fight against something our size. The bar, which had gone quiet the moment Draz shoved me, now scattered entirely. I heard chairs scraping back, glasses being abandoned, a dozen different species deciding all at once that this was not their business and they would very much like to be somewhere else when it became someone's business. Daniel, Ethan again, moving to stand beside me, shoulder to shoulder. "This is a bad idea. I know. I'm still with you. I know that too." Laura had gotten Vex behind the bar counter, out of the immediate press of bodies, and I saw her lean over and say something quick and urgent to the bartender. I hoped it was something like "call security," though a part of me already understood that security would take several minutes to arrive, and several minutes was a very long time when you were standing across from four creatures, who each outweighed you by a considerable margin. Draz rolled his massive shoulders, the gesture of someone settling into a familiar rhythm. "In my culture," he said, loud enough for the whole bar to hear, loud enough that I understood this was as much a performance as it was a threat, "we do not fight with insults. We fight to establish what is true. You believe you belong among the stronger species. Let us discover whether that belief survives contact with reality." "We're not looking for a fight," I said, and I meant it, even as every muscle in my body had already decided otherwise. "You put your hands on my friend. That's not something we're going to stand around and discuss." "Then we are already fighting," Draz said. "We simply have not started yet. I want to explain something about what happened next, because I think it matters. I was not a soldier. I was not trained in any formal combat art. I was an engineer who had grown up on Earth, in a city that still had its share of rough neighborhoods and rougher nights, where you learned certain things about how to handle yourself simply by existing in the world long enough. Ethan had grown up somewhere similar. Neither of us had ever expected those lessons to matter out here, among the stars, surrounded by species who had entire academies dedicated to the art and philosophy of combat. But those lessons were still in us, buried under years of politeness and diplomacy, and careful behavior. And in that moment, standing in the hollow star, with four Corvith traders closing in around us, those old instincts woke up all at once. One of Draz's crew, a broad trader with a scar across one eye, lunged first. He was fast for something his size, faster than I expected, and his fist would have caught me square in the chest if Ethan had not grabbed my collar and yanked me sideways at exactly the right moment. The blow that had been meant for me instead glanced off my shoulder, still hard enough to spin me half around, but not hard enough to put me down. I came up swinging. I am not going to pretend it was elegant. It was not the kind of fight you see in training halls, all clean lines and controlled strikes. It was messy, and fast, and full of the kind of improvisation that only comes from genuine desperation. I grabbed a bar stool because it was the nearest solid object, and I swung it because that seemed like the only reasonable response to a creature 3 times my weight trying to close the distance between us. The stool connected with the scarred trader's shoulder, and he staggered, more surprised than hurt. That surprise, I would come to understand, was the thing that mattered most that night. Ethan had grabbed a tray from a nearby table and was using it the way you might use a shield, catching a swing meant for his head and turning it aside. Behind us, I heard Laura's voice, sharp and clear, calling out to the bartender, and I heard the bartender shouting into some kind of comm unit, and somewhere in the chaos I caught a glimpse of Vex's eyes, no longer gray or white but a deep, furious red, watching everything unfold from behind the bar counter with an expression I did not have time to interpret. Draz himself had not moved yet. He stood back, arms crossed, watching his crew test us the way you might watch a demonstration, gathering information, waiting to see exactly what kind of fight we were. "Interesting," he said, mostly to himself, as the scarred trader shook off the stool and came at me again. This time I did not wait for him. I stepped inside his reach, close enough that his longer arms became a disadvantage instead of an advantage, and drove my forehead into the bridge of his nose, or whatever passed for a nose on a Corvette face. It was not a graceful move. It was not the kind of thing you learn in any formal training. It was the kind of thing you learn in the back alley behind a bar on a rough night, when someone bigger than you is not leaving you any better options. He staggered back, one hand going to his face, and for the first time that night, I saw something flicker across a Corvette expression that I recognized instantly, because I had felt it myself more than once in my life. Uncertainty. The other 3 moved in then, and the fight, which had been chaotic before, became something closer to a storm. I lost track of individual moments, individual blows. I remember Ethan beside me, always beside me, never more than an arm's length away, the 2 of us moving together with an instinct neither of us had ever practiced, but somehow both understood. I remember Laura's voice cutting through the noise, directing us, warning us, the diplomat in her finding a new use for the skill of reading a room, and calling out exactly where the next danger was coming from. I remember a chair breaking under someone's weight, though I could not tell you whose. I remember the bartender shouting that station security was on the way, his voice climbing higher with every passing second. I remember the strange, sharp clarity that settles over you in moments like that, when your whole world narrows down to the next second, and the one after that, and nothing else matters at all. And I remember Draz, still standing back, still watching, his 4 eyes wide now instead of narrowed, his arms no longer crossed but hanging loose at his sides, as though he had forgotten they were supposed to be doing something else. Because his crew, 3 seasoned traders who had built their reputations on their size and their strength, and their certainty that nothing our size could ever truly threaten them, were not winning. They were not losing. Not exactly, not yet. But they were not winning either, and for creatures who had never once considered that possibility, that alone seemed to be enough to shake something loose behind their eyes. I caught a glimpse of Vex again, still behind the bar, and something had changed there too. They were no longer simply watching. They had found something, a length of metal pipe or a broken chair leg, I could not tell in the chaos, and they were moving along the edge of the bar with the careful, deliberate steps of someone deciding whether to enter a fight they had spent their entire life avoiding. "Vex, stay back," Laura shouted, but Vex was not listening anymore. None of us were listening to the careful, sensible voices in our heads by that point. We had all crossed some invisible line, the one that separates the version of yourself who avoids trouble from the version of yourself who simply will not stand by and watch the people you care about get hurt. And on the other side of that line, it turned out, all 4 of us had exactly the same instinct. We fought together. Not because anyone gave an order, not because there was some plan any of us had agreed to in advance, but because that was simply what happened when the people you loved were in danger and you had run out of other options. The scarred trader came at me a 3rd time, angrier now, less controlled, And this time I did not meet him with a stool or a fist. I dropped low, under the wide swing of his arm, and drove my shoulder into his midsection with everything my legs could give me. It should not have worked. He outweighed me by more than double. But momentum and surprise are strange, powerful things, and he stumbled backward into the table Draz had been sitting at only minutes before, sending glasses and bottles crashing to the floor in a spray of noise that seemed to echo through the entire bar. For one long, suspended moment, everyone froze. The scarred trader lay half across the wreckage of the table, blinking up at the ceiling with an expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. His companions had stopped mid-motion, one still holding Ethan's tray shield at arm's length, another with a fist raised that had not yet found its target. Laura stood with her back against the bar, breathing hard, one hand still raised in the middle of some warning she had not finished shouting. Vex stood frozen at the edge of the counter, pipe in hand, red eyes wide. And Draz, arms still hanging loose, stared at the traitor on the floor, as though trying to solve some equation that had never once, in his entire long life, failed to add up the way he expected. The silence lasted exactly as long as it took for the doors of the hollow star to burst open, and for station security to come pouring in. Security did not stop the fight. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to everything that came after. They arrived, 4 officers in the gray uniforms of the station authority, weapons drawn, shouting for everyone to stand down, and for one breath, it looked like the whole thing might simply end there, with everyone lowering their fists and stepping back and letting the professionals sort out the mess. Then Draz, perhaps humiliated by what had just happened in front of his crew, perhaps simply unable to accept that the moment had slipped away from him, turned toward me with a low growl building in his chest. "This is not finished," he said, and lunged. He was faster than his size suggested, faster than I had given him credit for during all those minutes he had spent simply watching. His hand closed around my shoulder before I could get out of the way, and the strength in that grip was unlike anything I had felt before, an iron pressure that made my knees buckle even as I twisted, trying to break free. "Daniel," Ethan's voice, sharp with alarm. I did not have time to answer. Draz lifted me half off the ground with one hand, and for the first time that night, I felt something close to real fear, the understanding that this creature, for all his earlier restraint, could genuinely hurt me if he decided to. I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped trying to pull away and instead drove my heel down, hard, into the top of his foot, and when his grip loosened by even a fraction, I twisted my whole body around, using his own grip as leverage, and drove my elbow into the side of his head. It was not enough to put him down. Nothing short of a very determined effort was going to put Draz down, but it was enough to make him stagger, enough to buy the half-second I needed to break free of his hand and drop back to the floor, putting distance between us. He came at me again immediately, and this time Ethan was there, throwing himself into Draz's side with the full weight of his body, not enough to move a creature that size, but enough to disrupt his balance, enough to buy me another precious second to plant my feet and get ready for whatever came next. Around us, the rest of the bar had descended into complete chaos. The security officers were trying to separate the remaining combatants, but the other 3 Corvith traders, emboldened by their leader's refusal to stand down, had renewed their own efforts, and Laura and Vex found themselves fighting alongside us again. The 4 of us pressed back to back in the middle of the wreckage of what had once been a fairly ordinary evening. I saw Vex swing the length of pipe they had found, catching one of the traders across the forearm with a crack that made him roar and pull back, more from shock than pain, I suspected, since I doubted a simple metal pipe could do much damage to a Corvith hide. But shock, it turned out, was its own kind of weapon. These were creatures who had spent their entire lives being feared, being deferred to, being given space by every smaller species they encountered. They had never had to learn what it felt like to be genuinely resisted, and that unfamiliar feeling seemed to rattle them more than any blow we could land. Laura, of all of us, fought the smartest. She was not trying to overpower anyone. She used the wreckage of the bar itself, ducking behind overturned tables, using the confined space to funnel her attacker into positions where his size became a liability instead of an advantage. I watched her sidestep a heavy swing and use the trader's own momentum to send him crashing into a support column, and even in the middle of everything else happening around me, I felt a flash of pride so sharp it nearly stole my breath. Draz recovered from Ethan's tackle and turned his attention back to me, and this time there was no more curiosity in his expression, no more detached amusement. This was something closer to genuine anger, the anger of a creature who had built his entire sense of self around being the strongest thing in any room, and who was now discovering, in front of witnesses, that this was no longer entirely true. "You will not embarrass me again," he said, and swung a fist that would have ended the fight immediately if it had connected. It did not connect. I do not fully understand, even now, looking back, exactly how I managed to duck under that swing. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was simple desperation, perhaps it was the strange, focused clarity that had settled over me since the fight began, the sense that my body somehow knew things my mind had never consciously learned. Whatever the reason, I dropped low, felt the wind of his fist pass over my head, and drove upward with everything I had left, catching him under the jaw with the heel of my palm. It was, without question, the hardest I had hit anything in my entire life. Draz's head snapped back. He stumbled, one hand flying up to his jaw, and for a long moment he simply stood there, swaying slightly, blinking down at me, with an expression I would spend the rest of my life trying to properly describe. It was not pain, exactly, though I am sure there was some of that. It was something closer to disbelief. The look of a creature confronting a fact his entire worldview had insisted was impossible. "How," he said, quietly, almost to himself, "is that possible?" I did not have an answer for him. I was breathing hard, my knuckles already beginning to ache, my shoulder throbbing where his grip had bruised it. I was not thinking about physics or biology or whatever question was turning behind his four wide eyes. I was thinking about Vex, still swinging that pipe somewhere behind me. I was thinking about Laura, outmaneuvering a creature twice her size with nothing but quick feet and a sharp mind. I was thinking about Ethan, who had not left my side once, not for a single second, since the moment this had all started. That was the thing none of them understood, I realized later. Not fully, not in that moment, though I think some part of Draz was beginning to. This was never a fight about strength. Not really. It had never been a contest of who could hit harder, or lift more, or take more damage before falling. It was a fight about four people who had decided, somewhere along the way, without ever needing to discuss it out loud, that they were not going to let anything happen to each other. Security finally managed to separate us. Four officers wedging themselves bodily between our group and the remaining Corveth traders, weapons raised, voices raised even louder, demanding that everyone stand down immediately or face immediate detention. This time, the message landed. Draz, still rubbing his jaw, straightened slowly and stepped back, and one by one, his crew did the same, breathing hard, several of them nursing bruises and scrapes that I was fairly certain none of them had expected to be carrying home that night. I stood there in the wreckage of the hollow star, chest heaving, every part of my body aching in ways I would not fully appreciate until the next morning, and looked around at what remained of the bar. Tables overturned, chairs broken, glass scattered across the floor, catching the dim lighting in 100 small, scattered points. The bartender stood behind the counter with his head in his hands, and I found myself, absurdly, wanting to apologize to him. Laura was beside Vex, one hand on their shoulder, checking for injuries with the same careful attention she gave to every negotiation. Ethan stood next to me, breathing hard, a fresh bruise already forming along his cheekbone, and when he caught my eye, he managed something that was almost a laugh. "Well," he said, "that escalated." "Yeah," I said. It did. Draz was staring at us, all four of us, standing there battered and breathing hard, but still standing, still together, still very much unwilling to back down even now, with security weapons pointed at everyone in the room. And something in his expression had shifted entirely from where it had started, hours ago, when he had first wandered over to our table with nothing but easy contempt in his eyes. "You should have fallen," he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. "By every measure my people understand, you should have fallen the first time I put my hand on you." "We don't fall that easily," I said. "So I am learning," Draz said. The security officers moved to separate the two groups fully, ordering everyone toward opposite sides of the room, and as they did, I caught one last look from Draz before he was led away. It was not anger anymore. It was not contempt either. It was something closer to a question, an unresolved calculation still running behind those four wide eyes, and I understood, even then, exhausted and aching and standing in the ruins of a bar that had been perfectly ordinary only 20 minutes earlier, that this night was going to follow all of us for a very long time. I did not know yet exactly how far the story would travel, or how many species across how many trade routes would eventually hear some version of what happened in the Hollow Star that night. I did not know that this fight, born from nothing more than a shove and a grip that should not have been allowed to happen, would end up changing the way an entire sector of the galaxy thought about the smallest, softest, shortest-lived species in the Alliance. All I knew, standing there with my friends around me, was that we had not backed down. Whatever else happened next, whatever consequences waited for us once the station authorities finished sorting through the wreckage, that much would always be true. We had not backed down, and we had not fought alone. The officer nearest to me lowered his weapon slightly, looking between the four of us and the four Corveth across the room, and let out a long breath that sounded almost like disbelief of his own. "Somebody," he said, "is going to have to explain exactly what happened here." Laura straightened, wiped a smear of dust from her sleeve, and stepped forward with the same steady composure she brought to every difficult negotiation, as though the last 20 minutes had not just turned an entire bar into wreckage. "I can explain," she said. "It will take some time. You may want to sit down." The station's administrative office was a small, windowless room 3 levels above the Hollow Star, and I spent most of that night sitting in it on an uncomfortable metal bench, waiting for someone to decide what to do with the four of us. Ethan sat beside me, holding a cold pack against his cheekbone. Laura had been pulled into a separate room almost immediately, her diplomatic status apparently earning her a more formal conversation than the rest of us. Vex sat across from me, still clutching the length of pipe they had somehow carried with them the entire way up from the bar, as though setting it down might undo whatever had happened that night. "You can let go of that now," I told them gently. Vex looked down at the pipe as if seeing it for the first time, and set it carefully on the bench beside them. Their eyes had settled into a color I had never seen before, a deep, thoughtful violet that I would later learn was the Tholix expression for something between shock and quiet wonder. "I have never fought anything in my life," Vex said. "Not once. My people do not fight. We observe. We record. We ask questions. That is what we are for." "You did fine," Ethan said, wincing as he shifted the cold pack. "Better than fine, actually. You clocked that guy pretty good." "I do not know what I was thinking," Vex admitted. "I only knew that I could not simply stand there while he had his hand on me, and then I could not simply stand there while he had his hand on you." They looked at me. I still do not fully understand why. "Because we're friends," I said. "That's usually how it works." Vex considered this for a long moment, their violet eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance. "My species has studied yours for many years," they said eventually. "We have files, records, behavioral assessments going back to your first contact with the Alliance. None of them prepared me for tonight." "None of us were prepared for tonight," Ethan said. The door opened, and a station official stepped in, a tired-looking Velkari woman with silver markings along her jaw and a datapad clutched in one hand. She looked at the three of us for a long moment, her expression difficult to read, and then gestured for me to follow her. "They want to speak with you first," she said. "The Corveth delegation is filing a formal complaint, Station Command wants your account before anything is decided. I followed her down a narrow corridor into a larger room, one with better lighting and a long table around which several figures were already seated. I recognized the station commander, a broad-shouldered human named Nathaniel Cross, along with two members of the Corvith trade delegation I did not know, and, to my genuine surprise, Draz himself, sitting near the far end of the table with a fresh bruise darkening along his jaw. "Sit down, Mr. Hart," Commander Cross said, gesturing to an empty chair. I sat. The room was quiet for a moment, everyone studying everyone else, and then one of the Corvith delegates, an older trader with gray scarring along both arms, spoke first. "We are told," he said, in the careful, formal tone of someone accustomed to negotiation, "that a fight broke out in the Hollow Star this evening between our trader Draz and his crew and a group of human residents of this station. We are also told there were injuries on both sides. We would like to understand what happened, from your perspective." I told them. I did not embellish anything, and I did not soften anything either. I told them about the comments, about the shove, about Draz's hand closing around Vex's arm hard enough to make them cry out. I told them about the moment I stepped between them, and everything that followed after. When I finished, the room was quiet again, and I watched the older Corvith delegate exchange a long look with his colleague before turning his attention to Draz. "Is this account accurate?" he asked. Draz was quiet for a moment, his 4 eyes lowered, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the confidence it had held earlier that night in the bar. "It is accurate," he said. The delegate's expression darkened, and he said something quick and sharp in the Corvith language that I did not understand, though the tone made the meaning fairly clear. Draz did not argue. He simply sat there, absorbing whatever reprimand was being delivered, and I felt something shift in the room, a recalibration I had not expected. "Among my people," the older delegate said, turning back to me, "physical contact of the kind you describe, without consent, is treated with great seriousness. It is not something we permit, even toward those we consider beneath our notice. Draz's actions this evening were a violation of our own customs, not simply an offense against yours." That was not what I had expected to hear. "I did not realize that," I admitted. "Few outside our culture do," the delegate said. "We have a reputation for strength and dominance that we have not always worked to correct, and perhaps that has led some of our own, like Draz, to believe that reputation excuses behavior it should never excuse." He paused, studying me with an expression I could not quite place. "What I would like to understand now is something else entirely. How did you fight him? All of you, together, without hesitation, without any apparent plan, and yet you moved as though you had trained for this your entire lives." "My people spend years in formal combat academies, developing the kind of coordination I am told you demonstrated tonight in a matter of minutes." I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered. "We didn't train for it," I said. "We just didn't want anything to happen to each other. I think that's most of it." The delegate's eyes widened slightly, and he glanced at his colleague again, some silent communication passing between them that I could not read. "That is a strange answer," he said. "It's the true one," I said. Commander Cross cleared his throat and leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "For what it's worth," he said, "Station Security's review of the bar's internal recordings supports Mr. Hart's account entirely. Draz initiated physical contact. His crew escalated the confrontation after security arrived and ordered everyone to stand down. The human residents involved did not throw the first strike, and, notably, none of them attempted to seriously injure their opponents even when they had clear opportunities to do so." That last detail caught the older delegate's attention immediately. "Explain," he said. Cross gestured to the datapad in front of him, pulling up something on the screen. "There's a moment, about 6 minutes into the altercation, where Mr. Hart has a clear opening to strike Draz while he's off balance, in a way that our medical team tells me could have caused serious injury. He didn't take it. He pulled the blow at the last moment. Same with the young woman, Miss Bennet, and the strike she had lined up against your second traitor. Pulled that one too. Even the young Tholix cadet had an opening for a strike that could have done real damage, and instead redirected it to something far less severe. I had not even been fully aware, in the moment, that I had made that choice. It had simply felt instinctive, the same way stepping between Draz and Vex had felt instinctive. You do not seriously try to hurt someone, not really, not when the goal was only ever to make them stop. The older delegate sat back in his chair, studying me with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last few minutes, from formal detachment into something closer to genuine curiosity. "This is the part I find most difficult to understand," he said slowly. "Among my people, once a fight begins, it continues until dominance is firmly established. To hold back, to choose restraint in the middle of active conflict, is considered a sign of weakness, an admission that you lack the conviction to finish what you started. Where I come from," I said, "it's usually considered the opposite. Anyone can throw a punch when they're angry. It takes more control to stop yourself from doing more damage than the situation actually calls for." The room went quiet again, longer this time, and I watched something pass across Draz's face that I had not expected to see there. He looked, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely thoughtful. "I did not hold back," he said quietly. "Not once, not even after I understood I could not easily overpower you." "I noticed," I said, and could not quite keep a dry edge out of my voice. "And yet you held back against me," Draz said, "even after everything I did tonight." I considered how to answer that honestly. "I wasn't trying to win a fight," I said finally. "I was trying to make sure you stopped. Those aren't the same goal, even if they look similar from the outside." Draz did not respond to that immediately. He sat with it, his 4 eyes fixed somewhere on the table between us, and I watched the older delegate observe him with an expression that suggested this conversation was accomplishing something far more significant than the simple resolution of a bar dispute. The meeting continued for another hour after that, working through the formalities of the complaint, the damages to the Hollow Star, the terms of an apology that Draz would be required to issue, both to Vex directly and to the station more broadly. Laura was eventually brought in to help finalize the diplomatic language, and I watched her handle the entire process with the same calm precision she brought to every negotiation, as though the fight itself had simply been one more difficult meeting she needed to navigate. By the time we were finally released, the station's day cycle had shifted from night back toward morning, and the 4 of us walked out of the administrative offices into a corridor that felt strangely quiet after everything that had happened. Ethan's cold pack had long since gone warm. Vex still carried a faint, watchful energy in their posture, though their eyes had returned, slowly, to a more familiar pale gold. Laura looked exhausted in the particular way that came from holding an entire room together through sheer force of will. "That could have gone worse," Ethan said, as we made our way toward the residential level. "It could have gone a lot worse," Laura agreed. "I've handled disputes that ended with far less understanding on both sides. I think," Vex said slowly, "that I understand humans less now than I did yesterday, and I have studied your species for a full year." I laughed, tired and aching but genuinely amused. "Welcome to the club. Most days I don't fully understand humans either." "No," Vex said, more seriously than I expected. "I mean it. I came into this assignment believing I understood the shape of your species. Short lives, soft bodies, a tendency toward emotional decision-making that my instructors considered a weakness to be studied, and eventually exploited in negotiation. Tonight, I watched 3 people who had every reasonable justification to walk away from danger choose, instead, to place themselves between that danger and someone they had known for less than a year. Their violet eyes settled on me, thoughtful and unblinking. I do not have a category for that in my research. "You don't need a category for it," I said. "It's just what you do for people you care about." "That is precisely what I do not have a category for," Vex said. We walked the rest of the way back to our quarters mostly in silence, the four of us worn thin by adrenaline that had long since burned itself out, leaving only exhaustion and a strange, quiet satisfaction in its place. I did not know it then, standing in that corridor with my closest friends, all of us bruised and tired and unmistakably still ourselves, but the story of that night was already beginning to spread beyond the walls of the Hollow Star, carried first by station gossip, then by trade delegations passing through Corin's reach, and eventually, far beyond anything any of us could have predicted, out across the wider currents of the Alliance itself. It took about 3 weeks for the story to come back around to us, in a form we barely recognized. The first sign was small. A cargo hauler docked at Corin's reach, crewed mostly by a species called the Orin, insectoid traders, known for their meticulous record-keeping and their general disinterest in anything that did not directly concern profit margins. One of their junior officers, a young Orin named Kess, approached me in the docking bay while I was running diagnostics on a shipment manifest, and stood there for a long moment, simply watching me work, before finally speaking. "You are the human from the bar," Kess said. It was not a question. I set down my datapad, mildly surprised. Word travels fast. Word travels very fast when it involves a Corvith trader losing a fight to 4 unarmed civilians in a public establishment, Kess said, in the flat, precise tone that most Orin used for everything, whether they were discussing cargo weights or apparently now bar fights. The account has been shared across several trade routes. There is some disagreement about the details. What kind of disagreement? Some versions claim you fought 12 Corvith traders alone. Others claim you defeated them using only a broken chair leg and your bare hands, without assistance. One particularly persistent version, which I have heard from 3 separate sources, claims you broke a Corvith jaw with a single strike. Kess tilted their narrow head slightly, antennae twitching. I am attempting to determine which details, if any, are accurate. I could not help but laugh. It was 4 of us. Draz and 3 of his crew. Nobody's jaw got broken as far as I know, though I did hit him pretty hard. That is considerably less dramatic than the versions circulating through the trade routes, Kess said, sounding almost disappointed. Sorry to ruin the story. You have not ruined it, Kess said. You have simply confirmed the part that matters most, regardless of the exaggerations. 4 humans, none of them soldiers, none of them trained fighters, chose to resist a physically superior species rather than retreat, and inflicted enough damage to force a full stand-down and a formal complaint process. That detail alone has generated considerable discussion. Discussion about what, exactly? Kess considered the question with the same careful precision they seem to apply to everything. About what humans actually are, they said finally. There has been a general assumption across much of the Alliance, since your species joined 6 years ago, that humans represent a smaller, softer, more emotionally volatile addition to galactic society. Useful for certain kinds of diplomacy, certain kinds of trade, but not a species to be taken seriously as a physical or strategic threat. That assumption is now being reconsidered in several quarters. I did not know quite what to say to that. It was just a bar fight, I said eventually. Perhaps, Kess said, but bar fights are often more informative than formal demonstrations of strength, because they happen without preparation, without staging, without any opportunity for a species to present a curated version of itself. What happened in that bar is, by most accounts I have gathered, an accurate reflection of how your species actually behaves under genuine pressure. That is precisely why it has traveled so far, so quickly. Kess left not long after that, continuing on toward whatever cargo business had actually brought them to the station, and I stood there in the docking bay turning that conversation over in my mind for a long while before returning to my work. It was not the last conversation like it. Over the following weeks, I noticed small shifts, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. A Velkari trade delegate who had previously spoken to Laura with the same careful, faintly condescending patience she used with all junior diplomats began treating her with something closer to genuine respect, asking her opinion on matters she would not previously have been consulted on. A group of younger Corvith traders, passing through the station on unrelated business, went out of their way to seek out Ethan and me in the residential common area, not to cause trouble, but simply to ask questions, careful and genuinely curious questions about how we had fought, what we had been taught, whether all humans were raised with this kind of training. We weren't raised with any training, I told them more than once. We just didn't want anyone to get hurt, and we didn't want to back down. Most of them did not seem to know what to do with that answer. It did not fit cleanly into the framework they had built their entire culture around, a framework where strength was earned through discipline, through formal instruction, through years spent in academies designed specifically to produce warriors capable of dominating any confrontation. The idea that 4 ordinary people, with no formal training at all, could hold their ground against seasoned fighters, simply because they refused to let each other get hurt, seemed to unsettle something fundamental in how they understood the galaxy's balance of power. Vex, for their part, had begun compiling something they refused to let any of us read, spending long hours in the station's small research annex, occasionally emerging to ask one of us strange, specific questions. When Ethan pulled you out of the path of that first strike, Vex asked me one evening, weeks after the fight, as the 3 of us shared a meal in the common hall, how did he know to do that? Was there a signal, a prearranged plan? No, I said. He just saw it coming and grabbed me. But how did he know to grab you rather than simply warn you verbally? A verbal warning would have been faster to deliver and would not have put him at risk of also being struck. I thought about that for a moment. I think warning me might not have worked in time, I said. Grabbing me did. He didn't really think it through. He just did the thing that would keep me safe. Vex made a small sound, something between a hum and a sigh, and made a note on the datapad they carried everywhere now. This is the 7th instance I have documented, they said, mostly to themselves, of one of you prioritizing another's safety over your own tactical position, without any observable deliberation beforehand. My initial hypothesis was that this represented some form of trained reflex, similar to military conditioning. I am increasingly certain that is incorrect. What's your new hypothesis? Ethan asked, genuinely curious now. Vex's eyes shifted to a thoughtful violet. That it is not trained at all, they said. That it is simply how your species defines the people it considers family, whether or not they share blood. And that once someone crosses that line, into whatever category you reserve for the people you protect, the decision to protect them is no longer really a decision at all. It becomes automatic, immediate, faster than conscious thought. That sounds about right, I said. It is a very strange way to build a society, Vex said, though there was no judgment in their voice, only that same careful curiosity that had defined every conversation I'd had with them since the night we met. Most species I have studied build loyalty through hierarchy, through formal obligation, through structures that can be measured and predicted. Your species seems to build it through something closer to accident, proximity, shared experience, and once it forms, it appears to be nearly unbreakable. Laura, who had been quietly listening to the whole exchange, finally spoke up. I don't think it's an accident, she said. I think it's a choice, even if it doesn't feel like one in the moment. We choose the people we let matter to us. And once we've made that choice, most of us would rather take a hit than watch someone we chose take one instead. Vex wrote that down too, word for word, and did not say anything else for a long while. The story kept traveling. By the 2nd month, I heard versions of it from crews who had never been anywhere near Corrin's reach, passed along through the strange, informal networks that connected trade routes across the sector. Some versions had grown so far from the truth that I barely recognized them, tales of humans defeating entire Corveth war parties single-handedly, of impossible feats of strength that had never actually happened. But underneath all the exaggeration, one detail seemed to survive every retelling, the detail that Kess had identified as the true heart of the story on that first day in the docking bay. Humans did not back down, and when they fought, They fought for each other, not for themselves. Draz, to my genuine surprise, became something almost like an unlikely ally in the months that followed. He returned to Corin's Reach twice more on trade business, and both times sought me out, not with the old contempt in his eyes, but with something closer to careful respect, the kind two people develop after surviving something difficult together, even if they had started on opposite sides of it. I have told my crew a version of what happened that night, he admitted to me during his second visit, as we shared an uneasy drink in a quieter corner of the rebuilt Hollow Star. Not the exaggerated version circulating through the trade routes, the true one. I told them what it cost me to underestimate you, and what it taught me about your species that I did not understand before. What did it teach you? I asked. Draz considered the question with the same slow, deliberate care he seemed to bring to everything now. That strength among your people is not measured the way it is measured among mine, he said. We measure it in size, in raw power, in the ability to dominate whatever stands in front of us. You measure it differently. You measure it in what you are willing to endure for someone else's sake, and how far you are willing to go before you will allow harm to reach the people standing beside you. He paused, turning his glass slowly in one massive hand. By that measure, I am no longer certain my people are the stronger species. I am only certain we have spent a great deal of time assuming we were, without ever properly testing the assumption. I did not have a response to that. Not really, beyond a quiet nod and the shared silence of two people who had genuinely changed each other's understanding of the galaxy, in the strangest possible way, over the course of one chaotic night. 6 months after the fight, the Alliance held one of its periodic summits, a gathering of representatives from every member species, held that year on a neutral station several systems away from Corin's Reach. Laura attended as part of the human diplomatic delegation, and when she returned, she told us that the story of the bar fight had come up more than once during informal conversations between sessions, cited by several delegates, including, unexpectedly, a senior member of the Corvith Council itself, as an example of exactly the kind of behavior that had begun quietly reshaping how other species approached negotiations with humanity. They're not afraid of us, Laura explained, sitting with the three of us in our usual corner of the common hall. Not exactly. It's more like they've stopped assuming they already know what we are. Before, they had us filed away in some neat little category, soft, short-lived, harmless, in any real confrontation. Now there's this asterisk next to that file, this unresolved question, and it turns out an unresolved question makes people a lot more careful than a settled assumption ever did. So we made the galaxy more careful, Ethan said, by getting into a bar fight. More or less, Laura said, and could not quite suppress a small, tired smile. Vex, still carrying their datapad, still adding to whatever growing document they had never let any of us fully read, looked up from their notes with their eyes settled into that familiar, thoughtful violet. I have been assigned a new research focus, they announced. My instructors have asked me to expand my study beyond simple behavioral observation. They want a full analysis of what they are now calling the human loyalty response. There is even a proposal circulating within my academy to send observation teams to several human settlements across the Alliance, specifically to study this phenomenon in greater depth. Please tell me you're not going to call it that in any official reports, I said. The human loyalty response sounds like something out of a bad research paper. It is, in fact, precisely what it will be called in the official report, Vex said, entirely serious. I have already submitted the initial draft. Ethan laughed so hard he nearly knocked over his drink, and even Laura, exhausted from months of increasingly complicated diplomatic meetings, allowed herself a real, unguarded laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. I sat there in the quiet warmth of that moment, surrounded by the people who had stood beside me in the wreckage of the Hollow Star all those months ago, and thought about how strange it was that one ordinary night, one moment of refusing to back down, had somehow rippled outward into something none of us could have predicted. We had not set out to prove anything to anyone. We had not been trying to send some grand message about the strength or resilience of humanity to the wider galaxy. We had simply been four friends, refusing to let each other get hurt, doing the only thing that had ever made sense to any of us in that moment. And somehow, without ever meaning to, we had made an entire alliance of ancient, powerful, deeply confident species stop and ask themselves a question they had never seriously considered before. What exactly are humans capable of when the people they love are in danger? I did not have a perfect answer to that question. Not then, and not now. I only knew what I had seen with my own eyes that night, in a small, ordinary bar, on a small, ordinary trade station, when four people who cared about each other more than they cared about their own safety had simply refused to stop standing between danger and the people they loved. Maybe that was the only answer the galaxy really needed. It was just a bar fight, after all. At least, that is what I keep telling everyone who asks.